I was 9 years old and hadn't laughed once since the night Mama died. Not a giggle, not even a smile. 2 whole years of quiet that felt like forever. Then July 14th, 2023. A barefoot boy I'd never seen before slipped through our back gate and started dancing like the silliest clown you ever saw, just for me. His feet were dusty. His jeans had holes in the knees. And he had the biggest grin I'd seen since Mama used to smile at me before bedtime. What Daddy didn't know yet, what none of us knew that hot summer afternoon, was that this skinny boy making me laugh again was my own half-brother. The baby Mama had been rescued 10 years earlier. The one she never stopped looking for. The one she died still praying would come home. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. I remember the way the backyard smelled that summer. Like cut grass and honeysuckle, and the way heat sits heavy on your skin in Middle Tennessee. I sat in my pink wheelchair under the magnolia tree most afternoons, counting clouds because it hurt less than thinking about Mama. The wheelchair was still kind of new. I'd only been in it for about 8 months, ever since the accident that took Mama and my legs all in one terrible night. Daddy had taken me to every doctor money could buy. Physical therapists in Nashville, specialists in Memphis, a neurologist in Atlanta who talked about nerve damage and spinal trauma and words I didn't understand. Nothing brought my legs back. Nothing brought my laugh back either. I used to laugh all the time before. Mama said I laughed in my sleep. Now I just sat under that magnolia tree and tried not to remember too much. That's when I saw him for the first time. This boy peeked through the gate like he was checking to see if it was safe. He looked about my age, maybe a little older, 10 or 11. Skinny in that way boys are when they're growing faster than they're eating. His hair was dark and messy. His feet were bare and dirty. And his eyes, I remember his eyes were this warm brown that reminded me of something I couldn't quite name. I thought he'd ask for water or food, and then leave like the others did sometimes. We lived on the edge of town, where the houses spread out, and people passed through on their way to somewhere else. But he didn't ask for anything. He just looked right at me, tilted his head like he was thinking real hard, and then he started dancing. The silliest, goofiest dance you ever saw in your life. He hopped on one foot, then spun around with his arms out like a windmill. Then did this move where he wiggled his whole body like a fish flopping on a dock. I didn't mean to, but my mouth twitched at the corners. He saw it and grinned even bigger. Then he bowed like a prince in one of those old movies Mama used to watch, sweeping his arm across his body all dramatic. That's when I felt it. This tiny bubble in my chest that I'd forgotten existed. It rose up through my throat and came out as the smallest laugh. More like a hiccup than a real laugh. But it was there. And the second it happened, I started crying because I hadn't made that sound since before Mama died. The boy stopped dancing. He looked worried for a second, like maybe he'd done something wrong. Then he smiled softly and kindly and waved at me before slipping back through the gate and disappearing. I didn't tell Daddy about him that night. I don't know why. Maybe because I thought I'd dreamed it. Maybe because it felt too special to share yet. But the next afternoon I wheeled myself back under the magnolia tree and waited. And just like before, around 3 o'clock, when the sun was hottest, that gate creaked open, and there he was again. Same holy jeans, same bare feet, same grin. This time he brought a stick and pretended it was a cane, doing this old man walk that made me laugh for real. Not just a hiccup but an actual laugh that came from my belly. It felt like medicine. Like something broken inside me was starting to remember how to work. He stayed for maybe 20 minutes, never said a word, just danced and made silly faces until I was smiling so hard my cheeks hurt. Then he waved goodbye and left through the gate again. This went on for 5 days straight. Every afternoon around 3 he'd show up and dance for me. Sometimes he'd pretend to be a robot. Sometimes he'd do cartwheels, even though he wasn't very good at them, and usually fell over halfway through. Sometimes he'd just spin in circles until he got dizzy and stumbled around like he was drunk. I started wheeling myself to the backyard earlier and earlier, waiting for him, hoping he'd come. By the 5th day I was laughing so much I almost forgot what it felt like to be sad. Daddy noticed. He'd been watching from the porch that whole time, probably not sure whether to run the boy off or let it be. That afternoon he came down the steps and walked across the yard slow and careful, like he didn't want to scare him away. The boy stopped dancing and stood real still, watching Daddy with those big brown eyes. Daddy knelt down in the grass so he was eye level with him and said, "What's your name, son?" The boy looked at me first, like he was checking if it was okay to answer. Then he said, "Jacob." His voice was quiet, kind of hoarse, like he didn't use it much. Daddy asked, "Where's your mama, Jacob?" Jacob shrugged in that way kids do when they've stopped expecting answers to certain questions. He said, "Gone a long time." Just like that. No emotion. Just a fact. Daddy's face did this thing where it got real tight and his eyes got shiny. He asked, "Where are you staying?" Jacob pointed vaguely toward town. "Around." Daddy nodded slowly. Then he said, "You hungry?" Jacob's eyes lit up for the first time. He nodded. Daddy stood up and said, "Come on inside. We'll get you something to eat." That was the first time Jacob came into our house. He sat at the kitchen table while Daddy made him a sandwich. Ham and cheese with mustard. Jacob ate it so fast I thought he might choke. Daddy made him another one. Then a third. Jacob ate until he couldn't anymore. Then leaned back in the chair and looked around our kitchen like he was memorizing it. Daddy asked him gentle and patient questions. Where was he sleeping? The abandoned garage behind the old mill. How long had he been there? A few weeks. Where was he before that? Different places. Foster homes mostly. Jacob answered every question like he'd answered them 100 times before, and knew nothing would change because of it. But then Daddy asked something different. He said, "Why did you start dancing for my daughter?" Jacob looked at me sitting in my wheelchair by the table. He said, "She looked sad. Like she forgot how." That's when I asked him, "How to what?" Jacob said, "How to be a kid." And something about the way he said it, like he understood exactly what I was feeling, made me start crying again. Not sad crying, just the kind of crying that happens when someone finally sees you. Daddy had to leave the room for a minute. I heard him in the hallway taking deep breaths like he was trying not to fall apart. When he came back, his eyes were red. He told Jacob he could come back any time he wanted, that he didn't have to stay in that garage, that we had a guest room if he needed it. Jacob looked suspicious, like maybe it was a trick. But he said thank you, and left through the front door that time instead of sneaking out the back gate. I watched him walk down our gravel driveway in his bare feet, and wondered why nobody had ever taken care of him before. What I didn't know then, what none of us knew, was that Jacob had been carrying a secret in his pocket for 10 years. A crumpled Polaroid picture that was so worn you could barely make out the image anymore. He'd had it his whole life. It was the only thing Kayla, his birth mother, had left him with, when she dropped him at a fire station when he was 3 days old. The only proof he'd ever belonged to anyone. Mama used to tell me stories sometimes before bed. Stories about people she'd helped over the years. She had this way of loving people who had nowhere else to go. When I was still in her belly, she brought home a girl named Kayla. 16 years old, pregnant, and terrified. Kayla's own family had kicked her out. She had no money, no job, nowhere to sleep. Mama cleared out what was supposed to be my nursery and gave it to Kayla instead. She stayed with us for 6 months. Mama went to all her doctor appointments with her, held her hand during labor, was the first person besides the nurses to hold baby Jacob. Mama loved that little boy like he was already ours. She bought him clothes, diapers, and bottles. She rocked him at night when Kayla was too exhausted to move. She sang to him the same songs she'd later sing to me. But Kayla was young and scared, and didn't know how to be a mother yet. One night, when Jacob was about 6 months old, she left a note on the kitchen counter that just said thank you for everything, and disappeared. Took Jacob with her. Mama cried for weeks. She filed a missing person report, but Kayla was 18 by then, and legally allowed to go wherever she wanted. The police said there was nothing they could do unless there was evidence of harm. Mama never stopped looking. She hired private detectives when we could afford it. She posted on Facebook groups for missing children, even though Jacob wasn't technically missing. She prayed every Sunday at church that wherever he was safe and loved. She kept a box in her closet with all the baby things she'd bought for him. Little onesies and a blue blanket and a stuffed elephant. I found it once when I was about 6 and asked her whose it was. She got real quiet and said, "A little boy I used to know. I hope he's doing okay." Then she changed the subject. I never thought about it again until the summer when I was 9, and that boy showed up in our backyard dancing barefoot, like he'd been called home by something he couldn't explain. Jacob kept coming back. Every single day. sometimes twice a day. He'd show up in the morning before it got too hot, and dance while I ate breakfast on the back porch. Then he'd leave for a few hours, and come back in the afternoon, when Daddy got home from work. Daddy started leaving the gate unlocked. I started buying extra food at the grocery store. Started asking Jacob to stay for dinner. Jacob always said yes. He'd sit at our table and eat like he couldn't believe the food was real. Like maybe if he blinked it would disappear. Daddy watched him with this look on his face that I couldn't read. Sad and curious, and something else I didn't have a name for yet. One night after Jacob left, Daddy sat on the edge of my bed and said, "That boy reminds me of someone." I asked who. He said, "I'm not sure yet." Something started changing in me around that time. I'd been stuck in that wheelchair since the accident, doctors said maybe forever. But after Jacob started dancing for me, I noticed little things. My toes would wiggle sometimes when I wasn't thinking about it. My legs would twitch like they were trying to remember how to move. One afternoon Jacob was doing this spin move, twirling around with his arms out, and I tried to copy him. I lifted my right arm all the way up over my head without meaning to. I just did it. Daddy was standing on the porch holding a glass of sweet tea, and when he saw my arm go up, the glass slipped right out of his hand. It shattered on the porch floor in a million pieces. Jacob stopped dancing. I froze with my arm still in the air, scared I'd done something wrong. But Daddy started laughing and crying at the same time. He came running down the steps and knelt beside my wheelchair and said, "Do that again, baby girl. Move your arm again." I did. I lifted it up and down and side to side. Daddy grabbed my hand and squeezed it, and just kept saying, "Thank you, Jesus," over and over. That night he called every doctor we'd ever seen and told them what happened. They all said the same thing. Sometimes the body heals in ways we can't predict. Sometimes miracles happen slowly and quietly when you're not looking. I didn't care what the doctors said. I knew why my arm was working again. It was Jacob. It was laughing. It was remembering that being sad forever wasn't the only option. From that day on, I worked harder than I'd ever worked at anything. I did every physical therapy exercise the doctors gave me. I pushed myself even when it hurt. And every afternoon, Jacob would dance for me and I'd try to move a little bit more. First my arms, then my shoulders. Then one day, about a month after he started coming around, I wiggled my toes inside my shoes. By September, 3 months after Jacob first showed up, he was practically living with us. He still technically slept in that abandoned garage because he was too proud or too scared to accept Daddy's offer of the guest room. But he'd eat breakfast with us, spend the whole day in our backyard, eat dinner with us, and then leave right before bedtime. Daddy kept trying to get him to stay, but Jacob always said he was fine. I think he was afraid that if he accepted too much, it would all disappear. One evening in late September, after dinner, Jacob pulled something out of his pocket to wipe sweat off his forehead. It was an old Polaroid picture, so worn and faded you could barely see the image. But I saw it. I saw it clear as day. A woman with dark hair and a huge smile, holding a tiny newborn baby wrapped in a blue blanket. The baby was wearing a little knit cap with a pom-pom on top. My heart stopped. I knew that face. I'd seen it in photo albums my whole life. I'd seen it in the picture, on Daddy's nightstand. I'd seen it every single day in the mirror, because I had her eyes. "Where did you get that?" I whispered. My voice came out all shaky. Jacob looked confused. He said, "Been mine forever. The only thing I got from before." I reached out and took the picture from him real careful, like it might fall apart if I breathed too hard. I turned it over. On the back, written in handwriting I'd recognize anywhere because it was on every birthday card she'd ever given me, were the words, "Jacob, 3 days old. You are so loved." Mama's handwriting. Mama's words. I started shaking so hard I almost dropped the picture. I said, "This is my mama. This is my mama holding you." Jacob stared at me like I was speaking a language he didn't understand. Daddy came outside because he heard my voice and asked what was wrong. I handed him the picture. I watched his face go from confused to shocked to completely broken in about 3 seconds. He looked at Jacob. I looked at the picture. "Look at me." Then he sat down hard on the porch steps like his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. He started crying so hard he couldn't talk, just held that picture in both hands and sobbed. Jacob stood there frozen, not understanding what was happening. I wheeled myself over to him and took his hand. I said, My mama used to take care of you when you were a baby. She loved you. She looked for you for years. She never stopped." Jacob's face went pale. He said, "I don't remember her." I said, "I know. But she remembered you. And now you're home." Daddy pulled himself together enough to take Jacob inside. He went upstairs to Mama's closet and brought down that box of baby things. The blue blanket, the stuffed elephant, the little onesies with trucks and dinosaurs on them. Jacob touched each thing like it was made of gold. Daddy asked if we could do a DNA test, just to be absolutely sure. Jacob nodded. They did the swab right there in the kitchen. Sent it off to the lab the next morning. We had to wait 2 weeks for the results. Those were the longest 2 weeks of my life. Jacob kept coming around every day, like always. But everything felt different now. We all knew, deep in our hearts. But we needed that piece of paper to make it real. To make it official. To prove that Mama's prayers hadn't been wasted. That the little boy she'd loved and lost had found his way back home. The results came back on a Tuesday afternoon. Daddy was at work. I was in the backyard with Jacob. We were working on my standing. He'd hold my hands and I'd try to get my legs under me. Even just for a second. The mail came around 2 o'clock. I heard the truck pull up and asked Jacob to go check if there was anything important. He came back holding a big envelope from the DNA lab. His hands were shaking. I said, "Open it." He said, "I'm scared." I said, "Me too." "Open it anyway." He tore it open carefully and pulled out the paper. Read it twice. Then looked at me with tears running down his face and said, "It says probability of siblingship, 99.998%. I started crying. He started crying. We just sat there in the grass crying together until Daddy got home an hour later, and we showed him the paper and he started crying too. Jacob wasn't just some boy who'd wandered into our backyard and made me laugh. He was my brother. Blood and bone and Mama's answered prayer. He was the baby she'd held and loved, and never stopped looking for. He was the reason she kept that box in her closet. He was the reason she posted on Facebook and hired detectives and prayed every Sunday. And somehow, 10 years after she lost him, he'd found his way back to the only people in the world who'd been waiting for him. Have you ever had heaven hand you back the piece of your mama you thought you'd buried? That's what it felt like. Like Mama had sent him herself. Like she'd been guiding his steps from wherever she was, making sure he'd end up exactly where he belonged. Daddy didn't waste any time after that. He called a lawyer that same week and started the process of becoming Jacob's legal guardian. It took 6 months of paperwork and court dates and meetings with social workers. But on January 15th, 2024, a judge signed the papers that made Jacob officially ours. Jacob Harrington. Not whatever last name he'd been carrying around from foster care to foster care. Harrington. Like me. Like Daddy. Like Mama. He cried when he saw his new name on the papers. Daddy gave him Mama's old sewing room. We cleared out the sewing machine and the boxes of fabric and painted the walls blue. Jacob picked out his own bedspread. Cars and trucks. He hung the Polaroid picture of Mama holding him on the wall above his bed in a nice frame Daddy bought. That room became his sanctuary. The first place he'd ever lived that was really his. And me? 6 months after Jacob first danced into my life, I took my first shaky step. It was on a Saturday morning in January. Jacob was in the backyard waiting for me like always. Daddy was inside making breakfast. I'd been working so hard in physical therapy, pushing myself every single day. And that morning something just felt different. I stood up from my wheelchair, holding onto the handles tight. Jacob saw me and froze. He said, "Ellie, what are you doing?" I said, "I'm going to walk to you." He said, "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." And I believed him. I took one step, then another, then another. My legs shook so bad I thought they'd give out. But they didn't. I made it 3 whole steps before I had to grab onto Jacob's hands to steady myself. We both started laughing and crying at the same time. Daddy heard us and came running outside, and when he saw me standing there, holding my brother's hands, he fell to his knees in the grass and thanked God out loud. Daddy signed the adoption papers that same week. He said there was no point in waiting anymore. Jacob was ours. We were his. That's all that mattered. The judge had already approved everything. It was just a matter of making it official. On January 20th, we all went to the courthouse and stood in front of the same judge who'd granted guardianship. She smiled at us and said she'd never seen a clearer case of a family finding each other. She signed the final papers and handed them to Daddy. Jacob Michael Harrington. Legally, and forever. We went out for ice cream after. Sat in a booth at the Dairy Queen and ate sundaes until we were too full to move. Jacob kept looking at his new birth certificate like he couldn't believe it was real. Like maybe if he looked away it would disappear. But it didn't. It was real. He was real. We were real. It's been almost 3 years now since that July afternoon when Jacob first danced through our back gate. I'm 16 years old. I walk on my own now. No wheelchair, no crutches. The doctors still call it a miracle. I call it love. Jacob's 15, taller than me now, and still dances barefoot in the backyard most evenings. Only now I dance with him. Standing, spinning, laughing until our sides hurt. Daddy sits on the porch swing Mama used to love, and watches us with this peaceful look on his face. Sometimes he cries. Happy tears this time. We all still miss Mama. That hole never really closes. But having Jacob here makes it hurt a little less. It's like she left us a piece of herself that we didn't know we needed until he showed up. Some nights, when it's just me and Jacob in the backyard watching fireflies, I tell him about Mama, about how she used to sing off-key in the kitchen, about how she made the best chocolate chip cookies in the whole world, about how she loved him from the second she held him and never stopped. He listens real quietly and I can tell he's trying to build a picture of her in his mind. Trying to remember something he was too little to remember. I tell him it's okay if he doesn't remember. I remember enough for both of us. And besides, he knew her in a different way. He knew her through the love she left behind. Through the prayers she prayed that brought him home. Through the box of baby clothes she kept for 10 years. Through me and Daddy and the family she built that was always meant to include him. I think about that first day a lot. About how close we came to never knowing. If Jacob had walked past our house instead of stopping. If he'd been too scared to come through that gate. If I'd been inside instead of sitting under the magnolia tree. If Daddy had run him off instead of letting him stay. So many tiny moments that could have gone differently. But they didn't. They went exactly the way they were supposed to. And I have to believe Mama had something to do with that. I have to believe she was guiding Jacob's bare feet down that gravel road straight to our backyard. Guiding him to me. To the little girl who'd forgotten how to laugh. To the family who'd been incomplete without him. I still sit under that magnolia tree sometimes. Not in a wheelchair anymore, just sitting in the grass with my legs stretched out in front of me. Jacob sits beside me and we talk about everything and nothing. About school and friends and what we want to be when we grow up. Normal sibling stuff. The kind of stuff Mama would have loved to hear. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right and the honeysuckle smells sweetest, I swear I feel her there with us. Not in a scary way. Just in that warm, peaceful way that makes you know everything's going to be okay. That we're exactly where we're supposed to be. That her prayers didn't go unanswered. They just took a little longer to come true than she expected. If you've ever believed that a laugh can heal a family, drop a heart below and tell us where you're watching from tonight. If you've ever watched someone you love come home after you thought you'd lost them forever, I want to hear your story. And if a barefoot boy dancing in the backyard can bring a dead mama's prayer to life, hit subscribe and the bell. Because sometimes miracles don't look like miracles at first. Sometimes they look like a skinny kid with holy jeans and dirty feet who shows up right when you need him most. Sometimes they look like family finding each other across years and miles and heartbreak. Sometimes they look like love that refuses to let go. Even after death. I'll see you in the next one.